Yeah, I just wanted to go ahead and begin this presentation. The Office of Navajo Government Development is doing a presentation series, and much of the rationale behind our presentation series, as you notice, is that we have them scheduled at different times throughout the day, and we also have them at on Wednesdays, which is going to remain consistent with our presentations. The objective behind what we're doing here is to get information out to the Navajo people regarding governance at the Navajo Nation, and also to provide some information, background information regarding our form of governance and how we might be able to proceed to change the governance and so forth. Anyways, this is the Office of Navajo Government Development. We also work with the Commission, and the Commission is the Commission on Navajo Government Development. We did the traditional governance on Wednesday, March 13th, as you can see on the slide. Many of you attended, and we deem it as a success to get information out about local governance and the traditional governance of the Navajo Nation. And if you will bear with me, I've got something in my throat, so I sound a little scratchy, but other than that, I think I'm good to go. We also did the Diné governance from 1923 to the present. And the reason why we chose 1923 or 1922 to the present is because the current government was installed by the United States government, the federal government, back in 1922 by developing a business council, which started the ball rolling. And the United States government started interfering in our governance and trying to say, this is how you govern yourself, not the way you're doing it, not recognizing that Navajo people have been governing themselves for a long time before 1922. But nevertheless, they thought that they knew better and wanted to establish a government for us. So today's presentation will be on the key attributes of a democracy. And I am Harrison Tsosie. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Navajo Government Development. In addition to my introduction, because we're promoting Navajo traditions and Navajo form of governance, I'll provide you my clan information and so forth, just so we understand and establish each one of us, how we're related to one another and the kinds of duties and responsibilities we may have as a resulting of the way we're related. So the nenshlinige yakia aninshla kelachin ebashichin arosche yatorichin topahadanle shanale yatorichin. I see na shade ngai tsa wa holia todneshi do tan hot so khade are you see na sha a question hot fira hanil zendole. And then some of my education background is I've been an attorney for about 28 years, since 1995. Been a bar member here on the Navajo Nation, also with the Navajo Bar Association. Some of the employment I've undertaken during the years is being the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General with the Navajo Nation. So some of the information that I'm presenting is firsthand information as a result of the position as being an attorney for the Navajo Nation. So the first question here is, what is a democracy? We were asked this at a presentation I gave to the incoming delegates about a year and a few months ago back in at the Twin Arrows Resort. One of the delegates stood right up and said, "Bayan kigi democracy da dofne. Kat isho ya nihinle hawade. The now hata no. Ado dabati needed that don't get better husband that I know hatasi." So our definition of a democracy and the generally accepted definition of a democracy is very simple. It's rule by the people. And that's what the Navajo Nation has been governed by for a long period of time, our traditional form of governance. The Navajo Nation is not a totalitarian, authoritarian, a theocracy, or some other form of government. As you see, some folks were governed by a monarchy, kings and queens and so forth. But our traditional form of governance, and told in our traditional narratives and our what we call our creation stories, is that of a democracy where the people ruled the Navajo Nation. And that's what we're trying to promote, is going back to our traditional form of governance. So here it is, rule by the people. And then we put in some catchwords when you talk about rule by the people, is sovereignty. What is sovereignty? It's the collective will of a people. And I'll give some more definition to that in a later slide. And also, the government exists by the will of the people. So the 400,000 of us or more that are registered as Navajo tribal members, we delegate authority to the government. So the government should take action on our behalf to develop a governing system for the benefit of the Navajo people. And we'll talk a little bit more as we move on to that, maybe even in our next presentation. And the laws are enacted by and for the people. So normally you have a legislative branch that develops laws. And in our case, we have the Navajo Nation Council, who convenes every so often. And their primary responsibility should be to develop laws for the Navajo people. That's what they're charged with. And nevertheless, they also undertake a lot of other activities, which may be outside of the bounds of lawmaking. But nevertheless, that's what the legislative branch is charged with. Then a nation, or the sovereign, is ruled by laws. And in this case, when you have a democracy, because you have a large group of people, like in our case, over 400,000 tribal members, you would normally develop a system as to how the entire nation or the sovereign will be governed. And in our case, we say traditionally, behazani bikeho, ni kai behazani bikeho, ata we conduct ourselves in accordance with something that we call behozani, which is what makes things exist as they are, if that's the definition of behozani in the English language. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Now, this is how you establish rule by the people. And then we have that the powers of the government is to make the laws, to enforce the laws, and to interpret the laws. So in the case of the Navajo Nation, we have a legislative body that's charged with making the laws. And then the president was created in 1989 as a result of some turmoil. And the president's job is to enforce the laws. And we have a judiciary that interprets and applies the laws to a given case. So that's how normally you would structure a government, and that's how our government is structured. It doesn't have to be that way, but because our government started out as a result of the federal government coming in and starting our government, this is now how it's structured, kind of modeled after the way the federal government is structured. The first thing about an attribute of a democracy, and this is key, a democracy must be autonomous. It means that there's no external constraints. That is, it's governed according to the sovereign people's worldview and precepts, never under the tutelage or external restrictions of a public or foreign power. So again, the problem with the Navajo Nation government is the federal government's heavy-handed oversight, especially in the early years. As a matter of fact, when the Navajo Nation Council used to take action before 1985, the BIA used to sit there in the council chambers while the council proceeding was going on. And then when a proposed legislation was enacted, they were either classified as A, B, or C. And the A's needed approval of the federal government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, before it would become effective. If it was labeled as a B, it was kind of in the middle ground, and a C did not require the approval of the Secretary of the Interior. So we operated like that for a long period of time, up until 1985, when the United States government handed down the Kerr-McGee decision. And that's why we now celebrate it, saying the Navajo Nation or the federal government re-recognized the Navajo people as a sovereign nation. Therefore, it didn't need oversight, heavy-handed oversight by the BIA. So that's why we call it the Sovereignty Day. And that day will be coming up fairly soon for us to celebrate. The other thing that we need to talk about and specifically think about is legitimacy. In the case of the Navajo Nation, the question we have is, is if the federal government developed our current government, is it really legitimate? Because the Navajo people themselves have not consented to be governed by what we're governed by. And the powers that are exercised by the Navajo Nation government, are they legitimate? Because we didn't delegate those to the federal government or to the Navajo Nation government. In many cases, they were given basically by the federal government. An example is this idea that the Navajo Nation Council is the governing body. We see that in some of the earliest documents that were developed by the federal government. Primarily, there was a constitution attempt in the 1930s. There was a constitutional assembly, people participated, and one of the phrases in that document is the Navajo Nation Council is the governing body. And if the people did not delegate that, question is that legitimate? So legitimacy must exist in a democratic nation. And here I have in the slide, it says, this is precisely the government's ability to generate obedience, meaning obedience to the laws without there's a big spot on my screen. I don't know if you have that. Anyways, they can't coerce the citizens through state violence. That is, it's legitimate. The laws are legitimate, and the people see it that way. That's what we're talking about when we talk about legitimacy. And then in a democracy, no public power can exceed the authorization or the delegation and the foundational documents. So legitimacy, again, is the government's action is authorized and delegated by the collective will of the people as contemplated in its foundational documents. Currently, we look at Title II, which is the statutes of the Navajo Nation Code or the Navajo Nation. And we look at it and see if it was properly enacted by the Navajo Nation Council. And sometimes we have to go to the Navajo Nation Supreme Court to say, is this consistent with our form of governance? Is this consistent with the way we do things as a Navajo people? So they look at it to make sure that it's legitimate. Representation by elections. This is also a key attribute of a democracy. One of the things about having a large group of people that comprises of at least 400,000 people is that we can't all congregate to make laws. We can't all congregate to say this is going to be our policy from this day forward, or this is how things should be. So we elect representatives. In our case right now, we elect council delegates and a president to make those decisions and to provide leadership for us. As we said, the president executes or carries out the laws, and the council delegates, the 24-member Navajo Nation Council, makes the laws. So we're represented by these folks, and the government officials are elected by the people to represent the people. And then the elected positions belong to the people and is not a property right of the elected officials. That comes out of court case. Elections are held on a regular basis and at intervals suitable to the people. And then again, elected officials serve term limits and at the confidence of the people. Term limits is key because, as I'll provide in the next slide, since the people are the supreme in a democratic nation, there's usually a fixed time frame for conducting elections, right? Let me see if I can. And then one of the things we were discussing this morning, the council has before them legislation to fund the next elections, this upcoming next elections. So the question then is, why is it a low priority? Because elections should be the highest priority in a democratic society like the Navajo Nation. But instead, our election administration office, on a routine basis, every 4 years, has to go to the Navajo Nation Council and make requests for additional funding so they can carry out the elections. So that's a question that we have in regards to how the Navajo Nation operates. And then this is to make sure that political power of the nation is not concentrated in one single person. This is currently going on in Russia, where Vladimir Putin, I can't say his first name. Anyways, he has designated himself as a supreme leader of Russia and has rigged the Russian constitution to favor his reelection and for him to continue to serve rather than having somebody else come in his place to lead the nation. So that's an example of why you should have periodic elections. And then in the US, the president of the United States is elected every 4 years. He's elected to a first term of 4 years with a term limit of 2 terms. And the Navajo people thought we had the same type of term limits on our president. But we learned about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, that that's not the case. Here, the Navajo Supreme Court stated that the president can serve 2 terms of 4 years, sit out 1 term, and then can seek re-election. So that means you can be elected to 2 terms of 4 years, you have to sit out, and then you can run again. So in one lifetime, you're not limited to 2 terms of 4 years. And the question is whether that's something that was authorized by Navajo law. And it's all subject to interpretation. And that's what the Navajo Supreme Court is there for. And that's what they determined. Okay. So, and again, we look at the states and how their governor is usually elected and selected. This is all about representation. Who's going to represent you, who's going to lead you, and who's going to enforce the laws for you. So the governor usually does that. And periodic elections are very essential feature of a democracy because no one person is administering the nation. We had that about, when was it, 4 years ago, when Donald Trump tried to, he was out elected and tried to make some maneuvers as to how he could stay in the office. And unfortunately for us, the manner in which the law states that the presidents must change was consistent and was carried out in the last election. We don't know how things are going to go in the future, but nevertheless, it's important to at least have terms of office and periodic elections. And then in a democracy, human rights are respected. So what does that mean? A government that's formed and operates at the collective will of the people looks out at the rights of every individual citizen of that nation. So what are the human rights that we look at and will be at the forefront? The first thing in Navajo, we always say, ina. What is ina? And we have 4 elements of ina. The first element of ina is the right to breathe oxygen. Water. We all need water, right, to survive. And then there's the recognition of fire to cook our food, also to stay warm and so forth. So fire is considered to be an element of ina, or life. Then the last one is karatin, is recognized as a element of life in Navajo. And what karatin represents, if most of you have made karatin in the past, you take the corn pollen and shake it off the tassels of a plant into a bowl and so forth. At the end, there is a process. You put it out in the sun, it gets heated up and so forth. And what karatin represents is the plants that exist on the earth, all of the plants that provide nourishment, not only for humans, but for all critters also. All of the animals eat plants, we eat plants. Eolia, ina, that's what we call ina, those elements. And then the rights of all person within the territorial jurisdiction of the nation are recognized and applied to all persons, regardless of beliefs, tribal membership, citizenship, race, gender, sex, and national origin. So that's what we would have as a central attribute of a democracy. One of the things that's in discussion right now is same-sex marriage. And the Navajo Nation Council has been reluctant to recognize that. And it's a topic of discussion. And I think people have their own positions on this issue. But the question is, if we don't recognize that, are we truly a democracy? So that's another way to look at it. Anyways, I won't go any further on that, and you have your own positions on that issue. So here, government recognizes individual rights. I talked about ina, life, and the 4 elements of ina, and all persons have the right to enjoy, protect, defend their lives and liberties, right? So if somebody's coming to harm you, you defend yourself. All persons have the right to be with, protect, and defend their family. So again, you have a right to defend your family. And then all persons have the right to freely associate and whom they marry. So this is, as I just mentioned, a topic of controversy on the Navajo Nation. And at the end of the day, in a democracy, the majority would determine what we do in this particular situation, instead of just 24 people on the council. And this is one of those issues that maybe should be given to the people in a referendum or an initiative to determine, and then it would be settled. And somebody could bring it up again in 15 years, 20 years, and we'd address it again. That would be a democratic way of addressing the issue. And then the government, again, continues to recognize individual rights, liberty, the right to be free, freedom, right? So rather than being incarcerated or enslaved and so forth, we're in a democracy. You have the right to be free, the right to freely express your sentiments. So you can freely speak and say, this is how I feel. This is my position. So these are all terms that we use in Navajo when we say, this is our liberty, the right to practice a life way according to the dictates of one's conscience. So this is about religion. Are you going to be a traditional Navajo? Maybe you're going to follow some of the peyote way, or a Christian, or a Muslim, or a Buddhist. So there's all these different terms out there of how a collective group of people practice a life way. And we have a traditional, we call it the corn pollen path in Navajo. That's the life way that has brought us through the eons of time. And we have creation stories and so forth that tell us about that life way. And at the end of the day, our life philosophy is something that we call Sa'ana. And many of you have probably heard that. And even on that particular phrase, a lot of Navajos have differing viewpoints on what it means. Let me check my time. The right to keep firearms for peaceful purposes. And some people think that it doesn't have to be peaceful. We just have a right to keep firearms. So that's an issue that many folks in the broader United States are grappling with and contemplating right now. But it's in the United States Constitution, and in Navajo, we've always practiced the right to keep and bear firearms, not necessarily firearms, but weapons to protect ourselves. Traditionally, if you walked into a Navajo hogan, they would put the bow and arrows right there over the front of the door so you could hurry and grab them. And then maybe the spears right there next to the front door. And this was for protection. If an animal walked in, or if other people were making their way over to your camp, you would grab your weapons and be ready to defend yourselves. And that's just how Navajos had to survive for a very long period of time before our current situation today. The government recognizes individual rights. It continues. So individual rights is a big issue. The right to decide regarding one's body. This would be something like an abortion issue. Does the government have the right to tell you what to do, or do the individuals decide for themselves? So this is also a national debate right now. And then in certain cases, some parents will not take their children to see the doctor. They say it's against our religion to go see modern medicine or to be treated in this way. So we're not taking our children to the doctor. And in some cases, they suffer the consequences of those decisions, which has happened on a number of cases that I've read. And then the right to practice a life way again, the right to decide where to live, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So what that means is most of the people tend to seek a redress of their grievances to the courts. The average person, the average Navajo citizens, will usually go to the courts rather than to the president or to the Navajo Nation Council. And you file a petition. If you got married and you don't like it, you file for a divorce. Or some people go to the courts and petition to get married and so forth. And other people may say, I want to be heard, or somebody's infringing on my property rights. This auto dealership is repossessing my vehicle without following the protocols of the Navajo Nation, the laws of the Navajo Nation. So this is where the redress of grievances occurs, is primarily for the average Navajo citizen, is in the courts. But one of the things about the courts is, again, they're not heavily funded by the Navajo Nation Council. So sometimes they may fall short and the cases just swell up and build up because the funding is not there, or they don't pay enough for their different positions and so forth. Well, those are the kinds of issues that we have with the courts. The government recognizes individual rights. It continues the right to property, real property. Land is owned by the people, or the right to live on the land is something that the people have a birthright to. In our case, in our dealings with the United States government, we established a treaty of 1868. In Article 2 of the treaty, it says that the lands that we used to have, we reserved them. They weren't given to us by the federal government. We reserved those lands because we had Aboriginal title. We had a what we call an Indian title, maybe another word that they used to use, Aboriginal title, Indian title, and so forth. So what does that mean? That's something that was brought over by white folks, this concept of land ownership and title. But nevertheless, we took some of these concepts and put them into the Treaty of 1868. It says then land, the Navajo people, it actually says the Navajo tribe of Indians reserve the right to use and occupy the Navajo reserved lands. So that was in 1868. Today, we have to go to the Navajo Nation to get a home site lease. We have to go to the Navajo Nation to get a grazing permit. We have to go to the Navajo Nation to be able to farm. And I was making a presentation yesterday and saying, where did this idea come from? We never had to do that before. We didn't have to get a hunting permit, right? Because the treaty says we reserve the right to hunt so long as there's sufficient animals. But nevertheless, today we have to get a hunting permit. So these are things that we used to have that somehow disappeared from us, that today we now have to get a permit for. The other issue is items that are attached to the land, like firewood. We now have to go get a permit to collect firewood. So did we authorize this as a Navajo people? Did we say, okay, Navajo Nation Council, we give you this authority, we have this, but we're giving it to you to manage? Have we ever done that? I would say the answer is no. But nevertheless, those are the authorities and powers that they exercise. And it goes back to the question of legitimacy. Is it legitimate? So you should be asking yourself those kinds of questions. Then personal property, to be secure in their personal records and information, to acquire, possess, and protect property. The right to own intangible property, things like patents, different types of bank papers are intangible property, and so forth. The right to own use property as collateral. Right now, because the federal government claims to hold our title to our lands, we can't go to a mortgage company and use it as collateral, or basically as pawn as we know it, right? The only thing we can pawn is our personal property. So people, if they need a loan, they have to run down to Farmington, Gallup, or some of these pawn shops with their jewelry, with their vehicle titles, with everything else, only what is in their name, because the land is not in the name of Navajo people right now. And did we ever authorize the federal government to hold title to our lands? Because we had Aboriginal title. And I would look at the treaty and say, where did we say you have the right to hold our lands, to hold title to our lands, to right to manage it? It doesn't come out of the treaty, but it comes out of court cases around the 1900s, different court cases. And I'm not here to discuss those, but that's just something that you should recognize and understand also. The right to petition the government to make laws. Navajo people have a right to, by initiative, to make laws, right? Yesterday, we were talking with Eastern Agency Council and said, we have a 3-branch government. Everybody knows that. But the reality is the Navajo Nation has a 4th branch, which is the people, because the people can make laws either by a referendum or an initiative. But how come we don't do that? Because the thresholds are very high to collect signatures. You have to collect about 18,000 signatures to put an initiative on the ballot. So it makes it very difficult. And who's making it very difficult? It's our own people, the Navajo Nation Council. They say, oh, we don't trust people out there. We're going to make the threshold so high for them that they can't do it. And they're afraid of action, like the reduction of the Navajo Nation Council in 2008 and 9, when the Navajo people, by an initiative, reduced the council from 88 to 24. So that was an initiative, an example of an initiative. And that's about the only time we ever did one. And the reason why we don't do them is the cost of doing an initiative. It's very expensive. And as you all know, Navajo folks don't have the biggest, deepest pockets in the world. So that's why sometimes we say the initiative process is a toothless tiger. And then we have the right to petition the courts for redress of grievances, to petition the government to issue necessary governmental decrees and orders, issue patents, and so forth. So they say these are the kinds of services the government should provide. And then generally the courts provide the most direct contact with Navajo citizens, and I touched on that earlier. The government recognizes the rights of the collective group. What are our collective rights as a Navajo people? One of the things that happened when we signed the Treaty of 1868 is the United States government recognized the Navajo tribe of Indians as a sovereign. And what that means is, in the treaty, they recognize that the Navajo people have always existed as a sovereign and will continue to exist as a sovereign. So they didn't give us sovereignty, they recognized it. And that's a key term of art, is that they recognize that we're a sovereign, not that they were giving it to us. So that's a big distinction. But later in 1922, they acted like they gave it to us by creating our current government for us. Nevertheless, this is key. Powers of the government comes from the people and is legitimate. That's the collective rights of the people, is political power. So the definition of sovereignty, as I put it here, sovereignty exists when the collective will of a people creates an intangible force that empowers the people towards political, economic, and cultural integrity. Let me repeat that one more time. Sovereignty exists when the collective will of a people creates an intangible force that empowers the people towards political, economic, and cultural integrity. And I reread that twice because we may not have all of the components of that definition, the collective will of a people. Does our government operate at the collective will of the people? Right? And then empowers the people towards political, economic, and cultural integrity. We're losing our language, cultural integrity. We're the poorest people, economic integrity, right? So maybe it's not working. What we have may not be working. That's something to consider. The government recognizes the rights of the collective group. For some reason, my timer went off. The government has the responsibility to create a legal environment to foster an economy where the citizens can enjoy the fruits of their labor and a standard of living similar to surrounding sovereign communities. And then the government may coin or develop legal tender. And then we have the possibility of establishing the Uniform Commercial Code. That would make us consistent with the 50 states. They all enacted the Uniform Commercial Codes, and there's Articles 1 through 9. I think they actually added Article 10 now. Nevertheless, this is to make sure that commerce is uniform with the surrounding states and so forth, that we're not an outlier and that people would be afraid of us. The government exists and operates and develops laws in accordance with the culture, beliefs, traditions, and language of the people. So think about it for yourselves. Do we do that? The government may also recognize special interests amongst the population if the people are not monolithic. In a democratic nation, citizens must be able to assemble independently, both publicly and privately, to ensure their rights and points of view on any matter. And this is also a question that we sometimes have because we only have the Navajo Times, and it's really not independent because the government created them and funds them as an enterprise. And sometimes they come under Navajo political pressure and say, oh, do away with that. You shouldn't write this way. You shouldn't tell on us in this fashion and so forth. So that's the question. And do we have an open public forum for us to get what we would consider the truth? And the truth usually comes in many forms, but nevertheless, something to consider. Transparent decision-making by the government. Again, we're talking about a democracy. Laws must be public, published, available, and free. We don't really have that today because you've seen these blue books. They're over there on my shelf. But anyways, it's a volume of books like this. And then can everybody afford this thing? That's where the laws are. But they're not available and free. You normally have to spend some dollars to be able to get access to those. Even our court cases, they're not published. They're not up to date. So are we truly a democratic nation if people are hiding the ball from us? Again, something to consider. Lawmaking must be transparent. People should have an opportunity to be heard and provide input. We get a 5-day comment period. And sometimes we don't even get 5 days if it's deemed an emergency. So those raise some concerns for us. And we as a people did not put these laws into place, our processes and procedures. The legislative branch does it for themselves. So again, is that a democracy? Application of this laws must be fair and equal for all citizens. We all complain about nepotism. My favorite term out of a podcast I saw the other day is, how come when it comes to your relatives, there's no procedures, right? So people complain like that out there, and we make fun of it. Say this happens on the Navajo Nation. It probably happens everywhere else, but nevertheless, the application of the laws may not be equal in certain cases. And then dispute resolution forms must be accessible, open, and transparent. People must have ability to petition the government. So these are attributes of a democracy. And then we go to this section on how a democracy is structured. So how would you? Our office is charged with creating a government for the Navajo people. And the Navajo people are supposed to vote on our proposal by a referendum. And we're hoping to get that finalized and finished soon. And when we do, the question is, how are we going to structure it? Is it going to be unitary or a federal system? Are we going to have chapters? Are we going to have a central government? So those are the kinds of questions that we're dealing with. The first thing is the existence of a supreme law. In every democratic nation, there usually is the existence of a constitution, which is either written or unwritten. I think a lot of our young folks today have this thing about a written constitution because we're copying the federal system, the states. But the reality is we're operating under an unwritten constitution right now. We operated like that through the eons of time, how we carried our traditional governance that has gotten us up until 1923 when the federal government intervened. But before then, we had our traditional forms of governance. You probably have heard there was Nachid. There was going out among the communities. The communities would select young people to learn to become the leaders once the older leaders passed away. And they would fill those spots with these people that they selected and groomed to be leaders. That's our traditional form of governance. And it wasn't written, but it was unwritten. That's just the way we did things, and everybody knew it and everybody understood it. So that's our unwritten constitution. And then we also didn't coerce people. We said things, and if people wanted you to follow you, they would follow you. And if they didn't want to follow you, they didn't have to. So that's kind of our unwritten constitution. And then you have our system of clanship, which is part of our constitution, but it was unwritten. And we have responsibilities and duties to our clan members, to our mothers, to our fathers, to our children. That's how we regulated our society. So we've always had a constitution, and it may have been unwritten. So it's not something to fear. All we would be doing is memorializing these concepts if we developed a constitution. And here it says a constitution can simply be defined as the fundamental laws, the rules which guides a state or a society. The constitution is usually the supreme law and establishes the institution of government. Then it can be deemed, if everybody votes on it, as this thing called legitimate. Our government is legitimate because we all consented to it and said this is how it would operate. It's imperative to note there are two types of institutions, namely formal and informal institutions. And this is what I talked about. Formal institutions are those which discharge formal functions, like the three branches of government. And then on the other hand, there's informal institutions. And I talked about, we also talk about the press. They may be an informal institution. There's political parties that we could develop and so forth. On the Navajo Nation, I think one of the things we've identified is the traditional Navajos will usually vote as a group. The Christian Navajos will vote as a group. And then the Peyote Way Church folks may fall in there some between. So that's how a lot of us vote. And then the other one that people talk about is those that traditionally keep the language and those who don't keep the language. So there's different types of methods that we could segregate ourselves, but we really don't have an established political parties on the Navajo Nation. Then the other groups generally are the environmentalists, special interest groups. They have their own functions and their own way of influencing politics also. The rule of law. For a democracy to exist, it's essential there is a full state of the law. That is, everybody is subject to the laws and its dictates. This means no matter how large a political majority is, it's not able to use the institutions to carry out illegal or prohibited actions. So what being ruled by laws is, the way our system is structured is, if you violate the laws, traditionally you would run to the courts to say, I want an injunction against this person, or I want some kind of prohibition, a determination that they acted outside the laws. And the United States, sometimes they say that's unconstitutional. So you establish a process to challenge someone if they stepped outside the parameters of the law. So that's what the rule of law does for you. And then the other thing is, in the concept of a rule of law, a nation may be too big, so you develop laws, like in these statutes I was talking about, and you put them all in there. There's a taxing section, there's usually a commerce section, there's usually a land section, natural resources section, social section, marriage section, domestic life. All of these things are embedded in the statutes. And the people, the members of the society, must have access to those laws. And at the end of the day, they know how to conduct themselves in accordance with the law. Then there's the separation of powers for checks and balances. This was initiated in 1989, but apparently we don't listen too well, because one branch is always trying to get into the business of another branch, although there's supposed to be clear lines of demarcation between the three branches, right? These guys are always reaching over here. These guys want to reach over here and make laws. These guys want to reach over here and tell folks how to do certain things. So this is a problem that the Navajo Nation has today. There's not a clear separation of powers. Our checks and balances, like I said, it's only since 1930s, or 30 years since we've been practicing this. Maybe we need a little more time to perfect it. There's usually a direct democracy. This is being governed by the entire people. And then there's an indirect democracy, where you elect people to be your representatives and to act on your behalf. And Navajo, we've always been an indirect system of democracy, because our Natanis were voted in. We stood behind them at an election out at the local communities. Again, unitary versus federal. Should we just have one central government, or should there be a federal system where we include chapters or something else besides chapters, counties, who knows what? But anyways, it would have governmental functions, which is legitimate and authorized at two different levels rather than just one level. So that's another aspect. Freedom of expression. Again, I talked about that earlier. And then the exercise of justice is transparent, right? And sometimes it's sometimes difficult. And the one thing about this is people can't hide and say, oh, we're going to do this in private. The decisions have to be made available and public. As I said, right now, it's hard to get decisions out of the courts. And we don't know how they decided certain things because, as an example, I asked for a court opinion, and to this day, I have never received it. So that raises the question of whether or not we're transparent and whether we make information and legal determinations available. Political exercise is non-discriminatory. Democratic nation must guarantee the rights, unobstructed exercise, and suffrage. So people, the most crucial thing about a democracy is rule by the people. And you must establish your framework to be able to accomplish that, even if you're represented by elected officials. At the end of the day, somehow you must facilitate the people's ability to elect their leaders. And right now we're having questions of facilitating that function with our government because the election office is usually not funded until the last minute. So this is our next presentation. Navajo Government Reform Project will be next week. And all three of us, Damon, Tristan, myself, will be facilitating this particular presentation. And I am sorry I had to move things a little quicker at the end because I only gave myself an hour to make this presentation and my hour is up. But nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed it and continue to participate. And check our websites on a regular basis. We are the Office of Navajo Government Development. Thank you for listening in.